Hello, my name is David, and today I want to talk about data loss prevention and backup disaster recovery. The goal really of this video is to highlight how to design a plan for data loss prevention and backup disaster recovery around existing and low-cost technologies to basically reduce the risk of data loss involved with systems failure. I have a lot of small business customers who've never really even addressed any of this and found out the hard way that they didn't really have a data loss prevention or BDR plan in place when they needed it most. So today I want to talk about some of the steps you can take that are relatively straightforward to insure yourself against the eventual scenario where you have a systems failure and you're losing some data. So the steps that I want to talk about are sort of 5 steps, and I'm going to talk about them in more detail one by one. But generally, we're going to talk about sort of centralizing the storage of your data and implementing a good computer use policy and the benefits of those things. Then we're going to talk about the clear organization of your data and access rights to that data and the benefits of that. We're going to talk about volume shadow copy, which is an existing technology that's been part of Microsoft operating systems, both server and client workstation operating systems for a while. We're going to talk about Windows Server backup and recovery. That's also an existing technology in Windows Server operating system. And then we're going to talk about offsite replication, and for that I'm actually going to be talking about Microsoft Azure, and that's a new product offering from Microsoft. It's a hosted type of product that actually is a tiered product that has a whole bunch of different product offerings within. The product offering that I'm going to be displaying or showcasing today is going to be Microsoft Azure recovery services and the backup vault part of that particular product offering. So let's get right into it. In my test environment here, I am trying to sort of replicate a small business. We have a 2008 R2 server that is our primary domain controller running Active Directory, and it is also our file server. And the way this server is configured is such that it actually, to aid with centralizing the storage, it has several shares that users that connect to this server are going to be saving all their data on. The benefit of centralizing storage, once again, is that in your backup plan, you just really have to worry about backing up one system as opposed to worrying about backing up a whole bunch of systems that are in different places in the organization, and you're not sure if people are going to be shutting those systems down at the end of the day, things like that. So if you have a centralized plan where everyone stores things on the server, then you just have to back up that server, and your job of creating and planning for backup and disaster recovery is going to be a lot simpler. So in this scenario, that is how things are set up. We have our primary file server, which is also our Active Directory domain controller, that has 2 shares on it that are going to be used by everyone for both collaboration and storing their own files. The first share is going to be on the server, is going to contain all the collaboration data. It's going to contain several folders with different permissions to those folders that are shared with different groups and protected by different security groups. The way I've set this up in Active Directory is I've created several security groups and made the members that have access to those security groups members of those security groups. So here I have the S-Executive Security Group, and the members of that are Brian and the Executive Department user. Then to match, I have my Executive DD Executive folder, and that folder, the only people that can access it are going to be the system domain admins, administrators, and members of the S-Executive Group, which I just mentioned. Similarly, the public folder is really open to everyone, and the way that's done is by creating a S-Public group and adding pretty much all the members of my organization to that S-Public group. So if we look at the members of that group, that's what we have there. So that's how my data is organized in the main share on the server. And the benefit of that is, of course, that I know where all my data is, and I have it organized this way, so that, you know, users can't easily store things outside of that because it's being locked down. And then I have my user share. This share contains redirected folders. So redirected folders is part of sort of centralizing storage, and it's one way you can help centralize storage. Basically, what redirected folders does in Microsoft server operating systems, it's a technology you can implement via group policy. I won't exactly talk about how that's implemented today because there's lots of tutorials on the web that you can find on how to implement redirected folders. But in essence, what it does on the client workstations is it redirects a specific folder that is commonly used as part of the user environment of that workstation. It redirects that folder to the server. In this case, I'm redirecting the documents library, the default documents library for each user to the server. So currently on this workstation, a user named Brian is logged in, and his documents library is going to be redirected to the server on a hidden $share and a subfolder that is his username. So when Brian stores things in the documents library, they're going to be stored on the server. So if he copies this demo file 2 into his documents library, we can see that on the server, if we look in his redirected folder share, that the demo file 2 is there. So this is a great way of having, you know, a policy set in place so that when users store things in the right places on their workstation, the files are nice and secure on the server where they're presumably on redundant media, and you have some sort of backup policy in place for your server. So we'll talk about that in a little bit more detail in a bit, but that's how our workstations are set up. Now, back to our slides. Centralized storage of data really works best if it's paired with a good computer use policy. And what I mean by that is that you can implement policies in your organization, like written policies in your organization, that your employees sign when they first sign on with the company, that tell them what is, you know, a generally accepted practice when it comes to saving files and saving data and creating data in the firm. I see a lot of small business customers that I work for that haven't ever done this, and that really didn't think it was even a necessary or good practice because they were afraid that maybe some employees would be scared off or what have you. However, they do have understandings with their employees that, you know, browsing Facebook all day or browsing not safe for work sites is not accepted as a general computer use policy. So I've told those business owners, you know, if you're going to have that as a computer use policy, why not in that same policy insert a section about what is a good idea to save documents to and how to interact with documents, because that's, you know, the primary knowledge of your firm is all those files that people create and collaborate on. So what I recommend to small businesses is in your computer use policy, have a section that defines for employees what is okay to save documents, what location is okay to save documents to on their workstations, and what not to do as far as saving documents is concerned. So you want to have a section in there that says explicitly, do not save things on the C drive or the local drive of your workstation. Save things in the redirected folder that you have selected to redirect in your group policy, or in a shared folder. And the way that's configured in my environment here is that users have a number of ways of sharing and storing documents that is protected on the server. One of them is going to be the shared drive, which is on the network. And that is all these different locations that the user may or may not have access to based on his group permissions. But he has access to the public folder, so he can collaborate on files with other users in this area here. He also has a collaboration space that he can access, but for example, he won't be able to access the HR folder because he's not a member of that group. But in the computer use policy for this organization, users know that that's where they're supposed to save documents, so that's good to have. Alright, so let's move on to the next section, which is the clear organization of data and access rights. So I've kind of already touched on that with my original share here. This is very nicely organized. We have security groups for each of these folders, and they're named the same way the folders are named, or at least somewhat named the same way these folders are named, so that it's easy to understand who has access to what by just looking at the groups in Active Directory that match the names of these folders. I see a lot of organizations that are customers that have sort of one large share for the entire organization on a file server, and it's set up so that everyone has access to everything, and even worse than that, everyone has full control access to everything. I typically don't recommend that, and if I see that, what I recommend to those people is to do a reorg, where we create a nice root structure like this that has just the bare necessities of what different departments the organization has, perhaps, or what the sort of the main areas where people want to save things to are, and then what we do is we move the majority of things that are currently in the share to a public folder, and we make some department heads responsible for moving things out of that public folder into the appropriate root directories that they have access to. So they would be moving things out of public into executive and HR, depending on what those needs were. Now, it's not easy to do a data reorg, primarily because people have all sorts of links and shortcuts in Office applications as far as recent documents are concerned, and perhaps even on their desktop, that point to the previous locations of these files. So if you had everything here in the root share, and people had created shortcuts to all kinds of subdirectories of that share and files in that share, and then you move them to a new folder named public, then those links are going to be broken, and people will have a hard time finding where those documents are. So it's a good idea before a data reorg like that to make sure everyone is aware of what's going to happen, how they will be affected, and perhaps even some tips on how to resolve issues with broken links. That way, you can have a nice organized structure like this, and you don't have to worry about people accidentally deleting things that they shouldn't have access to and things of that nature. So that's really going to go ahead and prevent sort of the worst case scenario from happening, where you have some user who is maybe working in the warehouse and doesn't use a computer very often. He's clicking things, he's dragging things, he's accidentally dragging a whole subset of folders in this giant share that has a whole bunch of folders in it into another folder, and because he's scared, he didn't really know what he did, he didn't tell anyone for a number of weeks. People don't know that this happened, think that the files have been deleted, try to restore the files, and then you have two versions of the file. So all kinds of bad things can happen when you have a very large structure where everyone has access to everything. And the ideal way of dealing with things is to partition it out into smaller subsections and groups of users that have access to things, and not leave such a huge structure open so that to everyone, so that you reduce the risk of maybe people doing things that they shouldn't be doing. So that is really the second part of the second step you can take is again, understand your file system, understand the permissions to your file system, and organize it. Alright, so those two things kind of help prevent data loss altogether. Now let's talk about some ways of mitigating the risk once data loss has occurred. Alright, so we're going to talk about volume shadow copy, and volume shadow copy is an existing technology that's been part of Windows for some time, is part of Windows Server operating systems and part of Windows Client operating systems, and I recommend that you implement the volume shadow copy on both. You can implement volume shadow copy on client operating systems using group policies if you want to enforce that, but essentially what volume shadow copy does is it copies the primary drive, the primary hard drive of the system, and it basically takes snapshots of all the files as they currently are, even if those files are in use, even if those files are open in the applications that you use to edit those files. Basically, volume shadow copy will take a snapshot of those files as they currently are and save them to a location of your choice. In this case, I've configured the C partition of this particular server to utilize volume shadow copies, and I've dedicated another hard drive of this server specifically to storing those shadow copies or the snapshots of the C drive. This allows me to go ahead and back up my C drive, including those shares that I talked about earlier, to a separate drive with a separate space requirement on it, and it allows me to keep these snapshots for a number of time, or as much space I have on the shadow copies drive for, and then be able to recover documents using those shadow copies. And the way this works is if we right click on the C drive and then click on the shadow copies tab, we can go ahead and specify the settings for our shadow copies by clicking the settings button. Now in here we can go ahead and determine the volume that we want to create shadow copies for, and the drive that we want to save those shadow copies to. In this case I've chosen the S drive, which was specifically created for that purpose. I've also decided here to use the maximum space of that particular S drive for my shadow copies. I can decide not to do that if I so choose, but in this case, since the drive is dedicated, I didn't see any reason not to do that. And then we can create a schedule at which the snapshots are going to be generated. And here I've created a schedule which does 2 snapshots every Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, and Friday, which is the business days of my fictitious organization here. One that happens at 10 a.m. and one that happens at 4 p.m. And the reason I picked those 2 snapshots is because they are sort of during the most productive periods of the business, so that if someone creates a file at 8 a.m. and then accidentally overwrites it with an empty file at noon, they will have at most lost 2 hours of work, and they can revert back to the version of the file that was there at 10 a.m. when that snapshot at 10 a.m. was taken. Alright, so that is how volume shadow copy is set up and configured. Once again, at the main screen, you can see the number of volume shadow copies that has been taken. And this number here that you see, the number of snapshot, is going to be limited by the amount of space that you have on your S drive. The more snapshots you want to see in this rolling sort of tally of snapshots is going to depend on how large your volume shadow copy drive or the destination is. And if you want to see more here, you just increase the storage space on the destination. In my case, I have enough space here for almost a month's worth of volume shadow copies, but really the server hasn't been powered on, so I don't really have 2 snapshots per day for that entire period. But you could go ahead and design this solution for whatever you were comfortable with. I would recommend that volume shadow copy snapshots probably should be kept for about 2 weeks, and then we can do weekly offsite backups on a weekly basis for a longer retention period. Alright, so that talks about how to set up volume shadow copy. Let's quickly talk about how to use volume shadow copy to actually restore files. So let's say that this user Brian went ahead and deleted some documents from his documents library. Let's say he deleted these files, A Taste of China and A Taste of Mexico, and he wanted to recover those files. Well, he could contact the system administrator, and the system administrator could then go into the user share, look at the Brian Rader redirected documents folder, notice that those files are gone, and then attempt restoring those files by right-clicking the folder and clicking the previous versions tab of that folder, selecting a version of shadow copy that most likely still had those files, and opening that folder, grabbing those files, copying them back to the current location of that folder. So if you wanted to go ahead and put those files back, all you'd have to do is just drag them over. Alternatively, he could also go ahead and restore the entire folder, but doing that is going to possibly overwrite other files that may be more recent than this particular date, so I don't recommend doing that. But that's as simple as it would be to restore those files, and now the user can go in here and you see that his files have been restored. The end user can actually do this themselves as well. So if the user wanted to go ahead and restore things from his home directory, it would be easy enough for them to also right-click a particular folder or file and look at the previous versions of that folder or file and be able to restore documents themselves. They could even do this on the shared drive. So let's say they were they had accidentally deleted some things in the public folder. Well, they could go in here and look at previous versions of that particular file or folder and restore those. Now, to some people this is a great feature because it's kind of self-serve, document recover by end users. To some people it is not a great thing because it introduces the risk that some people misuse this, right? So if Brian here has access to the public folder, and the public folder is being used by 50 other users for collaboration, and Brian right-clicks that folder and says, you know what, I misplaced a document in here, and restores the public folder, the entire public folder, including all other subfolders, to a previous day, then he can very easily lose and erase work for other people that may have been in a subfolder here. So it's important, if you do use shadow copy, that you include some sort of training for end users and admonish them about the fact that they can do some real damage here using that particular feature set. One thing I should note is that users cannot restore documents for folders they don't have permissions to. So if Brian here tried to restore the HR folder, for example, he's not going to have permissions to do that because he's not a member of the security group that controls that folder. Alright, so that talks about volume shadow copy and how to use volume shadow copy to back up your system's hard drive for your server, your single point of storage at this point, and how end users can use it as well to restore their own files, and the possible caveat of having end users do self-service recovery. Alright, so let's move on and talk about the scenario of where the server may need recovery itself. So this particular, and this is step 4, this particular scenario is one where we've done a lot of work to sort of centralize the storage onto one server. And that's great because now we just have to worry about backing up that one server. But what happens if that server is down? Now consequently we have a whole lot of issues because everyone depends on the server for not only the files that they have saved themselves in their document library, it's only accessible to them, but also the files that they're collaborating on with other users. So to get that back up and running and the risk reduced of that server crashing, we're going to go ahead and use Windows Server Backup and configure that so that our server is backed up every day, and that we can recover that server if, let's say, the RAID array of this particular server was broken and the entire server, the main partition, the C partition, was lost and the server had to be recreated from scratch. I'm actually going to talk about that in a separate video where we recreate the server from a backup. But creating the backup and scheduling the backup is what I'm going to talk about in this presentation. So in this case, what I've done is I've used Windows Server Backup, which is part of, it's a role that you can just install in Windows 2008 R2 Server. And I've created a backup schedule that basically creates a bare metal recovery, which includes the system state, the local C drive, and some files needed for bare metal recovery. And I've basically gone through this wizard, selected a custom job, went on clicked on Add Items, then selected the bare metal recovery, which includes the system state, the bare metal recovery item, and the C drive, and specified a time during the day during which I want to do this backup. In this case, I've chosen 4:30 p.m., but it's probably better if you choose some later time during the evening to do this. And then I've selected a new volume. So in this case, once again, I have created a separate partition or drive just specific for server backups. And that is the drive that I'm going to go ahead and back up to using Windows Server Backup. and I'm just going to go ahead and keep the current destination here and cancel out of this wizard. But essentially the backups here are already configured such that they go to the server backup drive F, and they occur every day at 4:30 p.m. And currently I have 14 copies of that backup available, and I could start recovering you know, different files from that backup now. So if I wanted to go ahead and recover some files perhaps that were further back than my 2 weeks of volume shadow copy, I could recover them from here. Now, this is great if your server is up and running. If you don't have any way of getting to your server because it's down, then it's not so great. Then you're going to need to basically rebuild your server, and this backup that you have here is going to need to come from somewhere, right? So the F drive has to be physically separate from the server, but what if that drive is destroyed as well? So for that particular scenario, what we're going to talk about is sort of the last step in my backup recovery plan, and that's offsite replication. Now, offsite replication is really the way to ensure yourself against the risk of your building burning down, you know, some disaster, maybe a tornado destroying everything in your business, including the servers and including the workstations, so you really don't have anything left. So what offsite replication really does is it takes the backups that you're already taking and it rotates them off to several data centers across the western United States or across any part of the United States, so that, you know, the chance of those areas getting hit also with disasters is minimized. So for that we're going to use Microsoft Azure, and I've already went ahead and signed up for a Microsoft Azure account. It's pretty straightforward to do that. You can just simply navigate to azure.microsoft.com and sign up for a free account, and then log in using that account. And once you're signed into your Microsoft Azure account, and before I go over that, Microsoft Azure is essentially a tiered service. It allows a number of different things. It allows you to set up some virtual machines, some mobile device services, cloud services, all kinds of different things. What I'm using Microsoft Azure for in this particular presentation is going to be the recovery services portion. And to set up a new data backup vault, you're going to want to click on New, Data Services, Recovery Services, Backup Vault, click Create, specify the name of your backup vault and the general region closest to you, and then Create. This will create a backup vault that you can then basically access in the Microsoft Azure portal. Once you've gotten that vault created, you can then download a few things from the vault, basically the Vault Splash homepage or dashboard page. The first thing you're going to want to download is the Vault credentials, and then the Windows Azure Backup Agent installer. So once you've downloaded those two things, you're going to want to install the Azure Backup Agent, which is called the Mars Agent. Just a couple of side notes. I've already done this on this particular server, but when you install the Mars Agent, it will ask for the Vault Credentials file during the install, and it does require that you have the .NET Framework 4 and 4.5 installed on at least Windows 2008 server. So just be aware that the Mars Agent is going to require those two things. Once you've completed the installation of the Mars Agent, it's going to ask you if you want to add a server to that agent, and I've already done that. I've went ahead and configured this particular server to be the server that we're backing up. And the way I've done that is I've gone into the Microsoft Azure Backup Console and registered the server, once again with the Vault Credentials file, and then I scheduled a backup. The way I scheduled this backup is as follows. I went ahead and selected, I'm going to go through this job I've already created and just modified so you can see the settings. I went ahead and selected the C share and C user directories, but I've also included the F Windows image backup directory. This contains my daily server backups that are generated with Windows Server Backup. So I'm taking those 3 items and I am backing those things up off-site. And I'm doing this once a week on Friday at 5 a.m. I'm basically going and taking those items and backing them up to the cloud at Microsoft Azure. Now, this is a possibility for this particular small businesses because it has relatively high bandwidth available. This is not going to be a situation or an option for businesses that maybe have a T1 and 20 employees that are using that T1, primarily because that bandwidth is not going to be enough to send gigabytes and gigabytes of data, especially the Microsoft image backups offsite to a data center. So for those scenarios where you don't have a lot of bandwidth, you may want to consider an alternative solution of perhaps backing up to some sort of media, like a hard drive or a tape, and then rotating that particular media offsite as part of a set. Alright, so we're talking about Azure because I do have the ability of getting all my files offsite across the wire, and so the way I've set this up is that I want to have 1 year's worth of retention of my weekly backups. So I'm going to have 52 weekly backups that I can go back to in the Azure cloud, and those will be taken every Friday. And once again, this is the confirmation that I'm backing up some directories on the C drive and some directories on the F drive, and basically that job runs every week on Friday, and it'll show you on the splash page how many backups you have, and it allows you to do recoveries directly from the console as well. So this is nice to have. You know, let's say for example we were in a situation where we had a server down. We could install the Microsoft Azure Backup agent on any other Windows computer, even Windows 7, and we could start recovering data from our cloud. So if I wanted to go ahead and recover a particular file to this server from the C drive shares that I have backed up, I can either browse for those files and then specify the date that I want to go ahead and restore, the date of the backups that I want to restore from, using the sort of little date browser calendar icon here. So I can see all the dates that my server has backed up in bold. I can select one of them and then browse through the different shares that are being backed up on my system and just locate the file I want to restore and restore it. So that's as simple as that. One of the additional nice features that's part of Microsoft Azure Restore is that you can also search for files. You do have to use wildcards, but if I wanted to go ahead and restore that Taste of China file, I could probably find that file by just searching for the word China and selecting a previous backup snapshot here. I'm going to have to use the wildcard here, because China is not the full name of that file. But yeah, if I go ahead and enter that, I should be able to find that Taste of China, and here it is. So in Brian's home directory, there was that Taste of China PDF that we saw earlier that he deleted. So I can go ahead and locate that file using the Microsoft Azure Recovery Console, and I can restore it to its original location, or even another location if that server was down for some reason. So this is kind of nice to have, and this is basically how Microsoft Azure Backup functions. Alright, so that really covers all the steps that I wanted to talk about. Centralized storage of data and a good computer use policy so your employees know where to save things so that that data is backed up. Clear organization of data and access rights to that data so that you as the owner of the business or the administrator of the business understand how your file system is set up, and that there can't be, there's less chance for a user to maybe do something that they shouldn't in a directory that they shouldn't have access to in the first place. We talked about volume shadow copy and how that can be configured so that your workstations and your server basically have copies and snapshots of the hard drive at given parts of the day. You can configure those snapshots to happen whenever you want, and we talked about how to use a separate volume on the server to store all those snapshots on. We then talked about server backup and recovery for the server itself, so that if the server fails, we can go ahead and recover the server. In a separate video, I'll talk about how to actually recover a server from a server backup file that is on the server backup drive, and we'll actually even talk about how to recover the files from Microsoft Azure if that drive has failed as well. And then we talked about offsite replication and rotating data across the wire off to Microsoft Azure as part of the last step of your disaster recovery plan, so that if your building gets destroyed or if your hardware gets destroyed, let's say you have a flood and your server gets wet and everything is destroyed on it, and you now have at least one copy of all that data in the cloud stored for you, where hopefully there isn't a flood. Alright, so that really covers backup and disaster recovery and a data loss prevention plan for small businesses. It's intended for small businesses less than 25 employees. I'm not saying this is the best solution out there. It is a solution that is relatively cost effective, and if you have any questions, just drop me a line on my blog or put them in the comment section of this video. Thanks.